very pleased to have Gus Fauché join us. He's the Chief Economist with PNC Financial Services Group. Prior to PNC, Gus was a Senior Economist with the U.S. Treasury Department and a Director and Senior Economist at Moody Analytics. He's often seen or heard participating on CBS Radio, NPR, Marketplace, cited in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, among other places. In addition, we appreciate his participation in the aviation finance community, and we're very happy to have Gus join us today. Gus, thank you, welcome, and appreciate your comments today.
Thank you very much, Jim. It's a pleasure to be here this morning, and I'm glad we could all gather together virtually. And so I will be speaking for the first part of the program, and if you have any questions during my part of the presentation, just go ahead and type those in, and I'll try to answer as many as I can once I wrap up before the panel discussion. Obviously, we're in a period of very extreme economic dislocation. So there's a group called the National Bureau of Economic Research. They date expansions and recessions in the United States. And they announced in June that the United States economy had entered into recession in February of this year. That marked an end to the longest economic expansion in U.S. history. It lasted 128 months from the middle of 2009 to early 2020. And this is a very different recession than what we've seen previously. Previous recessions, if we think about the financial crisis and the Great Recession in the a decade or so ago, that was caused by problems in the housing market that spread to the financial system. If we think about the recession in the early 2000s, that was caused by the bursting of the tech bubble. The recessions that we had in the early 1990s caused by problems in the savings and loan industry and commercial real estate markets. This recession was caused by something external to the economy, the coronavirus pandemic. And so it's a very different recession from what we've seen previously. And in fact, it looks like that the recession likely ended in April or May of this year. So it will be a very short-lived recession, but it is also going to be a very severe recession in terms of lost economic output. We saw a lot of economic activity in the United States come to a halt. We've also seen an extraordinary policy response from the Federal Reserve and the federal government, and that is supporting a recovery that we're in right now. But there's still a lot of questions about the path of the pandemic and so forth, about the shape of the economic recovery, and we're just in a very, very difficult environment right now. So with the coronavirus pandemic, about one half of the U.S. economy is at risk. If we think about, if you go back to your college macroeconomics class, GDP, output of goods and services in the United States, that's composed of consumer spending, which is about 2/3 of the U.S. economy, in business investment and investment in housing, government consumption, government spending, and then also exports minus imports. And so a lot of the economy is at risk. Many aspects of consumer spending are at risk. So obviously consumers are still spending on healthcare, they're still spending on utilities, but we saw big declines in spending on many types of durable goods, things like cars and appliances. Non-durable goods, clothing sales dropped very sharply in the wake of the pandemic as people stopped going out. A lot of consumer services, people aren't going out to restaurants, they aren't going on trips. And then business investment was very weak. Businesses have pulled back on their investment. And then we also saw a contraction in home building. So you put it all, and then exports were weak because of the global economy and disrupted supply chains. So you put it all together, about one half of the U.S. economy was at risk, remains at risk from the continued spread of the coronavirus pandemic. And obviously that's caused enormous dislocation in the United States economy. And we saw that in the data that we received. If we look at the data from February to April, so before the pandemic started to when the contraction in economic activity was its greatest. So for example, we saw restaurant sales in the United States fall by about 55%. We saw auto sales fall by 50% over that period of 2 months. We saw housing starts fall by about 40%. We saw industrial production, output from manufacturers, mines, utilities, that fell by about 18% from February to April. Excuse me. And then we saw about a 5% contraction in real GDP in the first quarter of 2020, and that was with the pandemic really only taking effect in the last 2 weeks of the quarter. And so we saw an enormous contraction in economic activity. That being said, we also saw a huge increase in, first of all, in some areas of spending. So spending on food and beverages, basically grocery store sales, that rose by about 10% between February and April as more people stayed home. But we also saw a big increase in household income. The stimulus package was the first part of the stimulus package was passed in March, and then we saw additional stimulus spending in March and April. We had huge transfers to households in the form of the one-time stimulus payments. We also had expanded and extended unemployment insurance benefits, providing many more people were made eligible for unemployment insurance, and then they also received an extra $600 a week benefit. And so because of that, we actually saw what we call after-tax household income increase 10% between February and April, even as the economy lost more than 22 million jobs over that period. So we received enormous stimulus from the federal government. And so once households were able to go out and spend again, they actually have the cash to do so, even with the enormous loss of jobs and labor market income that we saw in the economy in between February and April. As I mentioned, we saw the economy lose about 22.5 million jobs between February and April. It basically wiped out about 9 years worth of job gains. We saw the unemployment rate go from 3.5% in February to almost 15% in April. That's the highest unemployment rate we've seen since the Great Depression in the 1930s. The pace of job losses is simply unprecedented in the US economy, but we have started to see the beginnings of a labor market recovery. So we've added about 7.5 million jobs in the US economy in between April and in June. We saw the unemployment rate decline from a peak of 14.7% down to about 11.1% in June. That's a little understated. There's some methodological issues, but we have definitely seen an improvement in the labor market as businesses that were closed temporarily during the pandemic have started to reopen. But still, even though we've seen huge job gains, we're still down by about 15 million jobs from where we were in February. The unemployment rate still remains very, very high. And we're starting to see some of that stimulus impact fade. So I think that's going to be very important for the economic recovery. A couple reasons why I'm encouraged by the potential for an economic recovery. First of all, as I mentioned, we had that big increase in federal stimulus spending that is supporting economic growth at a time when the private sector is very, very weak. Second reason is the consumers were generally in pretty good shape heading into this recession. Compared to what we experienced during the Great Recession, when consumers had very heavy debt burdens, were borrowing a lot, had high interest payments around going into that recession. This time, the household savings rate was much higher. Consumers have been very appropriate with their debt. They don't have nearly as much debt as they did last time. They had much higher wealth heading into this. And so that is certainly a positive. And I'm hopeful that as the labor market continues to improve, hopefully as we get more economic stimulus from the federal government, the consumers will be able to maintain their spending in the second half of 2020 and into 2021. Consumer spending accounts for about 2/3 of the US economy, and so that is going to be vital to the economic recovery. That being said, business debt burdens were higher heading into this recession than they were heading into the Great Recession. Now, low interest costs have offset that somewhat, but certainly I am concerned watching corporate debt burdens. One important factor for the recovery is going to be how quickly do businesses reopen. Obviously, there has been a lot of aid to small and medium-sized businesses. In particular, we had the Paycheck Protection Program. That was about $750 billion in low-interest loans to small and medium-sized businesses. Those loans will turn into grants if those businesses reopen and rehire most of their workers. So the program was specifically designed to have small and medium-sized businesses hold on to their workers through the worst of the downturn and then hopefully re-employ them. And if that's the case, those loans will turn into grants, which provides a strong incentive. the expectation is, the hope is that small and medium-sized businesses will be able to get through the worst of this, reopen on the other side, and that will limit the permanent job losses. We may have a lot of temporary employment losses, but the permanent job losses will be much smaller, and that businesses will be able to reopen and rehire. Now, obviously, that is a concern as we have seen the renewed spread of the virus over the past couple of months or so in many parts of the country. We see skyrocketing caseloads in many states. And that, of course, does raise concerns about the strength of the economic recovery. We had the initial hit to consumer spending, to the ability of people to get to work, to downturns in travel and tourism and so forth in March, and then especially in April, as we saw state mandated restrictions on economic activity. We've seen some states gradually loosen those restrictions, but I think it's more important at this point, rather than what governments are doing, it's more important how consumers feel. Do they feel comfortable going out and spending? And if consumers don't feel comfortable because we see the continued spread of the virus, then that is going to make for a much more difficult economic recovery. It's going to mean more business closures turn from temporary to permanent. That means that people will see permanent job losses. It's going to take time for new businesses to reopen, to take those place of the old businesses. We're going to see shifts away from, for example, traditional retailing towards more online services. We may see shifts in travel and tourism from air travel to more at-home travel, those types of things. And so it takes time for the economy to work through those shifts. So the longer the pandemic itself lasts, the slower the economic recovery will be and the greater the permanent damage to the U.S. economy. So in that respect, I'm discouraged by what we've seen with the renewed spread of the virus over the past month or so. I think we will need additional federal stimulus. Congress is working on a package. In particular, I think that there are three areas where it's very important that we get additional assistance from the federal government. The first is in combating the pandemic itself. As I mentioned, consumers aren't going to feel comfortable until we see the pandemic start to slow. And so therefore, I think any investments that we make in public health in terms of testing, in terms of containment, I think that's going to be vitally important to ensuring a recovery from the pandemic, ensuring consumer confidence and the ability of consumers to go out and spend. Second area that's going to be vitally important is aid to state and local governments. They've seen their revenue sources dry up, income taxes, sales taxes, as consumers go out and buy less. So we're likely to see enormous job cuts, spending cuts at the state and local levels. And so I think that aid to the federal government will allow aid from the federal government to state and local governments will allow them to keep many of those workers on their the jobs, and that would allow for a stronger economic recovery. And then the third is what to do about those extended unemployment insurance benefits that are set to expire at the end of this month. For many households, that $600 a week is incredibly important in supporting their spending. I know that there have been concerns about the negative impact of the increased unemployment insurance benefits on labor force, and that some workers are earning more under unemployment than they did before the crisis hit at their jobs. We obviously want to make sure that potential workers have a strong incentive to go out and find a job. At the same time, unemployment is very high. Many of those workers their jobs have disappeared. They don't have jobs to go back to. Their entire industry may have been maybe structurally smaller, so there are fewer job opportunities for them. So we need to continue to support their spending in the second half of 2020, while at the same time making sure that they have a strong incentive to go out and find employment. I'm hopeful that Congress can reach some sort of compromise, but I think those areas will be key. We've seen about $2 trillion, a little bit more in stimulus spending. I think that I would not be surprised if we see another package of $1 trillion or $1.5 trillion. We can worry about the cost to the budget, the national debt later. It's much more important that we have a strong economic recovery. And it's also much more important that we have, as I mentioned, a very strong response to the pandemic. The longer the pandemic lasts, the greater the structural damage to the U.S. economy, and the longer the economic recovery will be, and the slower long-run economic growth will be. Our baseline outlook for the U.S. economy at this point is that we do see a good, solid recovery in the second half of 2020, but that it's going to be a long time for the economy to come back. I think by the time all is said and done, we're going to see about a 10% contraction in real gross domestic output of goods and services in the U.S. economy. Just to put that in context, during the Great Recession, we saw the economy contract about 4% over 6 quarters. We're talking about a 10% contraction over a period of a couple quarters, so a much steeper contraction in a much shorter period of time. We will see solid economic growth in the second half of this year as the rebound starts, and then through 2021 into 2022, assuming we get additional stimulus from the federal government. But it's going to take a good couple of years before we see the level of GDP return to where it was before the recession started in early 2020. So I don't expect to see economic activity return to its previous level until sometime in the sometime in the first half of 2022. The unemployment rate, as I mentioned, is 11.1% in June. I would expect it will be below 10% by the end of this year, somewhere around 7.5% or so by the end of 2021, and then below 6%, maybe close to 5% at the end of 2022. That's a good, solid recovery in the labor market, but remember, heading into this crisis, the unemployment rate was just 3.5% in January and February of 2020. So it's going to take a very, very long time for the unemployment rate to get even close to where we were in early 2020. I think that's just an indicative of what we've seen, the damage that we've seen in the U.S. economy over the past 4 or 5 months. I do want to emphasize that the outlook remains very fluid at this time. So to be honest with you, I don't have a whole lot of confidence in my forecast. There are just so many unknowns out there about the path of the pandemic. Maybe we get a vaccine in the next 3-4 months that allows this to go away fairly quickly and we see a stronger economic rebound. Alternatively, maybe we have a bad flu season on top of the pandemic. Consumers continue to stay home well into 2021. That causes much weaker economic recovery and much more structural damage. Or even there's a potential for what economists are calling a W-shaped recovery, where we have a further contraction later this year because of the spread of the pandemic. Consumers start to pull back on their spending again, and certainly that we see the unemployment rate rise again in the second half of 2020. So that potential is out there as well. So just a huge amount of uncertainty out there. How effective these government programs are going to be, how effective we are in containing the virus, and so forth. I would encourage you to look at all of our materials at pnc.com/economic reports. We'll be putting out our July U.S. write-up later this week, and you can find that there. And then you can follow me on Twitter at Gus Faucher PNC. Thank you very much for your time. I see that we do have at least one question in. So the first question is can you comment on consumer confidence in flying commercial? And I would encourage, if you have additional questions, to submit those now, and I'll try to get to those. To be honest with you, there's a lot of psychology involved. It's not necessarily economics, it's psychology. Obviously some people feel comfortable in flying, but I think particularly as we see the pandemic continue to spread and get worse in many parts of the country, it's going to be very difficult for many people to feel comfortable flying. You hear stories about the airlines and how well they're doing or not doing at maintaining social distancing on their flights and so forth. So I think the big question, the big unanswerable there is how quickly do we get the virus contained? As I mentioned, if we get a vaccine fairly quickly, the pandemic recedes, later this year, then maybe people feel comfortable and air traffic levels return to not to normal, but certainly bounce back very quickly by the beginning of 2021. On the other hand, if the pandemic continues to spread, as we learn more about it, perhaps we have questions about how safe it is or not safe it is to travel commercially. So just a huge amount of unknowns out there that, as an economist, I really don't feel that comfortable answering. Any other questions from the audience?
Looks like that's it, Gus. I want to take the time to say thank you very much.
You're very welcome, and thank you very much for having me. And I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you this morning.
Thank you. We'd also like to thank PNC for allowing your participation and their sponsorship and support of NAFA. It's been very generous. Thank you.
You're welcome.